3 days without water. That was all it took to unleash a storm unlike any other, a tempest that swallowed the peak of Mount Sinai in a churning black cloud pierced by blinding lightning. The ground trembled, the air vibrated with a guttural horn blast, and the newly freed Israelites stood frozen, witnessing a power both terrifying and exhilarating. In that crucible of sensory overload, they swore an oath, a blood-bound covenant, promising holiness in exchange for protection, an unparalleled military shield, and overflowing harvests. They understood the consequence, explicit and terrifying, a curse of famine, plague, and exile for any betrayal, etched into the very air by the voice that shook the mountain. Barely had the ink dried on their spiritual contract when the first crack appeared. 40 days passed, and Moses, swallowed by the mountain's darkness, left the multitude stranded in the dry, merciless valley below. Fear, like a creeping desert vine, tangled around their hearts, a palpable sense of abandonment beneath the relentless sun. Desperate for a tangible God, a deity they could see and touch, they turned to Aaron, the high priest. A massive furnace roared to life, consuming thousands of gold earrings and bracelets ripped from their former Egyptian masters, melting them into a blinding pool of liquid gold, a golden bull cast in a heavy clay mold. The camp erupted in a chaotic, dust-choked festival, dancing wildly around the lifeless bull, drinking wine and stripping garments in a feverish frenzy. Up on the mountain, God's fury kindled into an inferno, a final, terrifying offer to wipe the rebellious nation from the sand, starting anew through Moses. Moses, descending with the sapphire-like stone tablets of the law, witnessed the drunken revelry and, in a devastating act of symbolic defiance, shattered them against the rocks, a physical embodiment of their broken promise. But was this a singular moment of weakness, a brief lapse in faith, or a harbinger of the destruction that would relentlessly pursue them? 3 days without water. That was all it took to shatter the fragile hope of a nation standing at the edge of paradise. Imagine millions of faces, once raised to the heavens in praise, now contorted with fear as the scouts returned, whispering tales of giants and cities scraping the sky. It wasn't a rational assessment, but a contagion of terror spreading through the tents like a desert fever. But the fear escalated beyond mere worry. It twisted into a collective madness. That night, a chilling cry ripped through the valley, a demand so absurd, so blasphemous, it defied comprehension. "Take us back to Egypt," they roared, rejecting the promise of freedom, embracing the chains they had so recently broken. The stones of Mount Sinai seemed to tremble with the sheer weight of their despair. God's fury responded with swiftness, a shadow falling over the camp. It wasn't a furious shout or an earth-shattering quake, but a calm, measured threat, a voice echoing across the desert, instant annihilation. A plague of locusts, a flood of fire. Anything but a slow, agonizing death in the wilderness. It was a choice, immediate oblivion or 40 years of wandering, a constant reminder of their betrayal. Moses, the man who had spoken to God face to face, intervened. He begged for their lives, arguing for a chance at redemption, even if it meant a generational curse. And so, the 40 years began. A slow, bitter march across the unforgiving sands. But a crucial question lingers: why condemn an entire generation to wander because of the mistakes of a few? Wasn't there room for mercy? Generations drifted, the sun bleached their bones, and the promise of Canaan faded into a myth. They tested God's patience at every turn: rebellion, idolatry, even outright defiance. It became a cycle, a recurring pattern of sin and consequence. But was it truly a divine curse, an inevitable script etched into the fabric of their existence? Or did something else, something hidden in the choices of those first spies, determine the fate of an entire nation? 3 days without water. That's all it took to crack the veneer of faith. The desert shimmered, a mocking mirage of what lay ahead. 250 chieftains, draped in the finest linen stolen from Egyptian palaces, marched toward Moses and Aaron, their expressions a careful blend of righteous indignation and simmering ambition. But did they genuinely believe they were standing up for the people, or were they simply hungry for power? The brazen act wasn't simply dissent. It was a direct assault on the divine order. They brandished bronze fire pans, once used for preparing sacrifices, now held aloft as symbols of their challenge. Unauthorized incense, a fragrant blend of costly spices and forbidden herbs, billowed, creating a choking cloud around Moses and Aaron. But the aroma, usually a sign of reverence, now reeked of rebellion. Then the ground groaned. A low rumble that resonated deep within their bones preceded the shattering moment. A fissure tore open, a colossal wound in the desert floor, a yawning abyss of blackness and screaming voices. Korah, the man who dared to challenge God's authority, along with his 250 followers, vanished into its depths, their treasures and finery swallowed by the earth. But what force could rip the world apart like that? The dust settled, leaving a gaping hole where Korah and his followers once stood, a stark testament to the unforgiving nature of divine justice. But this brutal display of power didn't extinguish dissent. It simply drove it deeper underground, breeding resentment and fueling a simmering rebellion against Moses' leadership. Was Korah's ambition a unique spark, or did it foreshadow a more pervasive and insidious corruption within the hearts of the Israelites? Imagine for a moment a land lush and green, a reward promised after generations of slavery, yet already tainted by the whispers of forbidden gods. The ancient oak trees, revered by Canaanites for millennia, now stood upon the hills of Israel, their branches adorned with crude idols, a stark symbol of a spiritual compromise that would unravel a nation's destiny. These weren't subtle acts. The prophets, Yahweh's fiery messengers, howled warnings of spiritual adultery, portraying Israel as a bride who cast aside her wedding vows for fleeting, dangerous affections. Amos, his voice raw with anguish, declared that God despised their feasts, their music, and even the scent of their sacrifices, because they were laced with the bitterness of hypocrisy. But the insidious nature of syncretism lay not in blatant rejection, but in the quiet integration, a slow erosion of boundaries. Imagine families bringing offerings of baked bread and first fruits, not only to Yahweh's altar, but also to a carved stone likeness of Baal, the storm god, seeking favor from both realms, hoping to secure blessings from every possible source. Then came the unthinkable, a horror so complete it defied comprehension. In the valley of Hinnom, a dark abyss carved into the earth, the Israelites began offering their own children to appease the perceived demands of Molech and Chemosh, monstrous bronze idols with outstretched arms poised to receive their gruesome sacrifice, a ritual intended to secure political alliances and false prosperity. King Manasseh, consumed by ambition and desperate to maintain power, became the architect of this unspeakable evil, erecting pagan altars within the sacred courts of Solomon's temple itself, profaning the very dwelling place of the divine. The air over Jerusalem became thick with the stench of burning flesh and the screams of the innocent, a horrifying testament to the depths of human depravity. But how could a nation, once freed by divine power, find itself spiraling into such darkness? What internal vulnerabilities allowed for this gradual corruption, this breathtaking betrayal of everything they swore to uphold? Perhaps the very abundance they were promised blinded them to the true cost of their blessings, leaving a silence hanging in the air, heavy with the coming storm. Imagine the stench of burning wood, the deafening drumbeat masking screams. This was the Valley of Hinnom, where infants were offered as sacrifices to foreign gods. Under King Manasseh's reign, the unthinkable became commonplace, a horrifying spectacle designed to secure political alliances and false promises of prosperity. Manasseh wasn't a lone monster, but a symptom of a festering wound within Israel, a society rotting from the inside out. The kings desecrated Solomon's temple, dragging Israel deeper into necromancy and bloodshed, until Jerusalem's streets ran red with the blood of innocents. But how does a nation, once chosen by God, descend into such blatant disregard for sacred law? Alongside the idolatry festered a culture of relentless injustice. Merchants cheated starving families using rigged scales. Judges took bribes to condemn the vulnerable, and the wealthy indulged in decadent luxury while their neighbors were sold into slavery for the price of a sandal. But what kind of society tolerates such extreme disparity, and what does it reveal about the erosion of moral foundations? The prophets, voices of a betrayed God, cried out against this wickedness, their words swallowed by the clamor of the marketplace. Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah denounced God's disgust for their sacrifices and hatred for their praise. Yet, the people refused to listen. What power does it take to silence a prophet? And what does it say about the state of a nation's heart? God's patience, stretched thin for generations, finally snapped. The time for mercy was over. The scales of divine justice irrevocably tipped. What would it take to shake a nation from its self-destructive spiral? And what catastrophic event awaited them as the consequence of their collective choices? The smell of roasting meat hung heavy in the valley of Hinnom, not the savory scent of a feast, but the sickening sweetness of sacrifice. Infants, their cries deliberately drowned by pounding drums, were offered to idols glowing cherry red in the twilight, a ritual intended to secure the king's power. Within the very walls of Solomon's temple, King Manasseh erected pagan altars, polluting the sacred space with foreign rituals. Hieroglyphs depicting deities of Egypt and Mesopotamia were carved onto the very stones intended for worship of Yahweh, transforming the heart of Israel into a nexus of forbidden practices. The marketplace, once a place of honest trade, became a theater of calculated theft. Corrupt judges, their hands greased with silver, twisted justice against the desperate, driving widows and orphans into a cycle of inescapable debt. Their simple sandals the price of a rigged verdict. Amos stood amidst the jubilant crowds, his voice cracking with righteous fury, declaring God's utter disgust for their prosperity built on the broken backs of the poor. Isaiah thundered warnings of impending doom. Jeremiah wept as he described a nation drowning in its own decadence. All voices ignored, lost in the clamor of false security. The silence that descended upon Jerusalem after Nebuchadnezzar's conquest was heavier than any stone, more deafening than the din of battle. It was the silence of a broken covenant, a shattered kingdom, a divine presence withdrawn, leaving behind a smoking ruin and a question: could even utter destruction signal a fresh beginning? 70 years. Imagine a bustling metropolis, the pride of an empire, silenced, a total absence of human sound. This wasn't a gradual decline, but a sudden absolute abandonment. Jerusalem, once overflowing with life, reduced to a desolate echo chamber where only the wind dared to whisper through the crumbling stone. But even within this silence, a fragile hope persisted, carried by a people scattered across the vast, foreign landscape of Babylon. They clung to the ancient promise made to Abraham, a single thread of faith woven through the tapestry of exile, that one day their descendants would return, and the land would bloom once more. The decree arrived unexpectedly. A single scroll carried by a royal messenger, Cyrus, the Persian king, commanded the exiles to return and rebuild Jerusalem. A man who had conquered the Babylonian Empire, yet inexplicably embraced the dream of a people he'd subjugated, granting them resources and permission to reclaim their ancestral homeland. But rebuilding wasn't merely a physical endeavor, it was a spiritual reckoning. Stone by stone, they reconstructed the walls of Jerusalem, and in doing so began to piece back together a shattered identity, questioning what it truly meant to be the chosen people after generations of exile and unimaginable loss. What legacy would they inherit, and how could they ensure this promise, this improbable return, wasn't snatched away again?